Welcome to Talking Infrastructure, the podcast brought to you by global infrastructure consultancy AECOM. In this series, we'll be discussing the hot topics, key projects, and innovations that are helping to solve some of the world's most complex infrastructure challenges. Hello and welcome to Talking Infrastructure. This today, a very special live episode from UKREiiF in Leeds. Today, we're going to be talking about the energy transition. We're going to be talking about how do we engage with communities to maximise the benefits of the energy transition and to ensure that we bridge the net zero divide, both within our local communities and nationally. Now, you'll be very glad to hear that it's not just me talking about this today. I'm joined by an expert panel. To my far right, we've got Jeremy Rathall, the founder and CEO of Cornish Lithium. To my left, we have Sarah Wardle, a director at Cavendish, a communications consultancy. And then right next to me, we have Eloise John, AECOM's energy lead for Europe and India. Can we give them all a quick round of applause? So, Eloise, we've chatted a lot about benefits of the energy transition, taking people with us. But what do we actually mean when we talk about benefits? Because they're quite wide range. And I think it's worth starting off and defining what we mean by the benefits.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'll start with a reminder, I suppose, that this is a multi-generational, once in a lifetime or multi-generation lifetime opportunity for us to do something that really delivers benefit, not just for proportions of society, but delivers benefit for everyone. And I think that if we categorize it into the four Ps, people, places, politics, and portfolio. So if we take those as individual items, from a people perspective, it's our responsibility as professionals within the sector to leave nobody behind within the energy transition. That includes making sure that we've got the skills necessary. There's a lot of discussion within the sector around the skills gap. There's reports that say that we are missing up to 400,000 people to enable the energy transition to be executed between now and 2050. That's a huge number of people. There's also many studies now that demonstrate that 60% of the workforce that are currently in education, actually their jobs in the future don't exist anymore. Oh, they don't exist at the moment. Mm-hmm. And we have to make those happen. And there'll be things that, you and I can't even imagine around AI, etc. So there's a huge piece around the energy transitioning, enabling some of that skills gap. There's also the innovation element. The energy transition has a unique opportunity to bring together a room of people who think differently. This is a fantastic example of that. And when you get those people in a room thinking differently, that's when innovation happens. So that's the people element. And I think at the beginning and end of any conversation, if you can walk away from that conversation saying, have you kept people at the forefront of the decision making? Are you satisfied? Are you morally satisfied that you've put people at the center of that decision-making process and the actions that you'll take? Then I think you can't be far away from the right answer. The places piece is really interesting. Again, it links very clearly back to the people element. We need a regional systems thinking approach to the energy transition. You pull one thing, it's going to move something somewhere else. So we need to think about it as a whole, but it needs to have the flexibility in it to be localized for specific communities, because I don't know what the lived experience in any one community is, and that community need to be able to benefit from it. And for that to happen, that face-to-face time, that understanding of how that community operates, what's important to them, where the strengths and weaknesses of their community are, is vital. And that links back into the politics, having something that enables us as a nation, but that is adaptable to a specific space, is really important. And then the final piece around portfolio, we need to create energy transition projects that are investable. And for that to happen, we need a portfolio approach. It can't just be one project here and one project there. So we need to create something that allows public and private to come together to move and make substantial steps forward. And if you wrap all of that with the people piece and brilliant communication that's clear, that's concise, that doesn't use language that isn't understood, but it's action orientated, then it's an easy thing to do, right?
Easy. Talking of easy, Jeremy, talk to me a little bit about the story around Cornish Lithium and maybe a little bit about how important the people are for you.
Yeah.
What you're trying to achieve.
Well, people are hugely important for us. So the project is what it says on the tin. It's in Cornwall and it's lithium for electric vehicles and battery storage. And really without lithium, the energy transition won't happen. Pretty much that's probably about right, because if you can't store renewable power in batteries, then it isn't going to happen. So we are about trying to get a domestic source of lithium so that the UK does not get supply side shocks like they had at when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we do need that sort of domestic security. And that's what we're all about. We have, in Cornwall, the right geology. That's the most important thing, where there is actually lithium in the rocks. You can't move geology. It's there and you can't shift it somewhere else. So we have to then address the communities which that will affect. And our projects are right throughout Cornwall. One of our main projects is in near St Austell. We have a local community we spend a lot of time talking to. I'll come on to that in a minute. But also some of our other projects, which are lithium in water brine projects, where we drill down to about 2,000 meters and then extract lithium from water using what's essentially a giant Brita water filter. Is that can be affect multiple communities. And we before we do anything like drilling, we engage with the local community to make sure that they understand and are happy with if we develop it, that they get the benefit. So the company's been going for 7 years now. We're very fortunate to have got recent funding from the UK Infrastructure Bank, so the UK government, and also that funding brought in funding from a Irish-based specialty metals funder, TechMet, and also a US-based energy and minerals group who invested alongside all of those three. So we really have got. We've crowded in funding. It's been hugely successful. But in terms of the local communities, we do take that obviously very seriously. The advantage we have is Cornwall has a 4,000-year history of metal extraction, which helps. So they understand that there's an opportunity here to develop these metals, which are going to be fundamental to the energy transition. Lithium being one of them, copper, tin, all of them are in Cornwall. But obviously those communities want to benefit. And how do they benefit? Well, at the moment, most people in this audience probably think of Cornwall as a holiday destination, but actually some of the most deprived communities in the whole of Europe are in Cornwall. And they want to see high quality jobs. They don't want to see their kids emigrating out of the county and having no choice but to emigrate, which is really what happens an awful lot. So how do we harness that pride in Cornwall of actually the fact they have got a 4,000-year history? How do we harness that into explaining how the community can benefit and, really harnessing that enthusiasm? And I think it's very important that a lot of people in Cornwall, you get a lot of people who've moved down to Cornwall. They are largely retired. They don't want change. They don't want to see change. They don't care about they don't care about the young people. They want to see their little paradise maintained. And we don't want to destroy that. We want to do it very, very responsibly and carefully. But we do spend a lot of time talking to, the community. And I think, what Eloise said just now is really, we need to understand what they want, not what we think they want, what they actually want.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Now, it's of course important to us that we're creating the content and discussing the topics that matter to you. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a minute to fill out our survey, the link to which you can find in the show notes. You could even win a Talking Infrastructure mug for your troubles. Thank you for listening. Now back to the episode. Sarah, what do people want? Cavendish have recently released a report, which hopefully is going to give us a snapshot of what they think and how they value infrastructure investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try and share a number of different statistics so you get the sort of the full picture of the report and how the different pieces all slot together. So first of all, the starting position around, what is the broader attitudes towards infrastructure? Do people feel that they are impacted at the moment by a lack of infrastructure within the United Kingdom? And I think this is one of the first statistics that really surprised us. In only 42% of those who were polled, which is a sample of around 2,000 people, felt they were negatively impacted by a lack of infrastructure. Now, I'll be quite honest, we probably expected that statistic to be the other way around, especially if you've ever been to a lot of community consultations in your professional life. Usually one of the top things that you hear from members of the public is that they do already feel like the infrastructure in their local area is perhaps not as strong as they would like it to be. In terms of when we drilled into the sort of the rationale and how people feel they are being negatively impacted, the top two sort of results that came out was, first of all, the rising cost of energy, and the second was public transport and connectivity. And I suppose just to add a political angle into this, again, coming back to what Eloise was saying at the start, there is a bit of a marked difference in voter intention and how people have responded to this survey. So 56% of Labour voters felt they were negatively impacted by a lack of infrastructure in the UK, whereas that was 38% for Conservative voters. Obviously, there was a little bit of whispers about whether we might get a snap election today, so I did just want to pop that in there. That probably won't age very well on this podcast, but we'll see. And in terms of the real barriers towards the infrastructure, 36% of people felt that the government were delaying and blocking infrastructure, and then 25% felt that one of the main barriers was local government. So you've got a vast majority of those, again, who were surveyed feel like the government is the main blocker as to why we're not getting the right infrastructure in the right places. And in terms of the types of infrastructure that people would more likely support, 87% of people said they would be happy to see a solar development within their local area. Again, that might surprise some, especially if they've worked on solar projects. And it is also, again, drawing on the political angle, quite surprising when we've had a ministerial statement, a week and a half ago, again, sort of emphasising the government's, I suppose, in many ways, caution around solar developments, especially and the impact it has on agricultural land. The second most popular piece of infrastructure for those who were polled was onshore wind at 73%. Again, will be interesting to see if any new government takes a slightly different approach to that. And then 43% was actually battery storage. So there does seem to be a little bit of a disconnect between the support for solar and then how that actually impacts battery storage and how the relationship is structured there. Now, this is all very much in line with a similar poll that we did in 2023, so we're reasonably confident that this is not a flash in the pan. These are results that do have a lot of parity with a similar study that we did last year. And I think one of I suppose, a really nice and reassuring statistic from the polling for a lot of people within the room and on this podcast is that new energy was more popular than schools, houses or rail, which is, again, quite a surprising piece of feedback. And there was a geographical divide as well within the country about what people would most like to see. So effectively from the south coast all the way up to Humber, people would like to see more sort of low carbon energy generation. And then from the Humber upwards, it was public transport connectivity throughout the country. And where the biggest concerns around hosting infrastructure locally, there were two things that pulled very strongly. So the first was impact on ecology, and then the impact on the existing infrastructure. And obviously, developers need to really be very cognizant of the kind of concerns that communities do raise and be able to address those in a way that isn't dismissive and sort of, badging people as NIMBYs, but very much being able to have that two-way conversation and try in many respects to address those. There's also a bit of an age divide in some of those statistics as well. So older voters tend to be more concerned about impact on infrastructure, whereas younger voters tend to be more impacted by ecology. Which is also very interesting to understand perhaps the direction of travel as we move forward and do more sort of engagement exercises on the scale of change that is required to meet net zero. So overall, what the results show, that there is still very much mixed feelings about new infrastructure. It varies based on demographic, it varies based on which area of the country that you're in. One of the really positive things is that there is clearly a good amount of untapped advocacy. Solar and onshore wind, we were very surprised to see those polling as strongly as they did. And that can be, really encouraging for the kinds of conversations we all need to have. Developers need to really understand these and be able to respond to them if we are going to have that national conversation around the scale of change that we need. So yeah, I hope that's a good sort of context setting.
Eloise, Jeremy, surprised by any of those statistics? Does it show a positive trend?
I think I'm very positively surprised. I mean, solar particularly, that's very interesting. There's some big solar developments going in near us in Cornwall. That's great, fantastic, and people want that. That's really good. And on onshore wind as well. I mean, Cornwall is very, very quite dense already with onshore wind, but also there's a big potential for offshore wind as well. So, it's good. Very positive.
Eloise, what are your thoughts?
I really like the interaction with the environmental aspects and the ability to deliver on something that's additionality there. And I think it'd be worthwhile having a debate around that untapped advocacy and how do we access that, because that is going to be so important, isn't it?
I think a lot of it comes down to that national conversation, I suppose, because, there is a disparity in the volume of infrastructure projects and where they are dispersed within the country. And it's, I think some of the conversations that are being played out at a local level is that communities that do have a number of infrastructure projects all happening in one area do in some ways feel put upon. This is a nationally significant infrastructure project, but they feel that they're having to disproportionately bear the brunt for a lot of that. And so we need to have much more of a broader understanding about how different parts of the country are playing this part in decarbonisation and hopefully cheaper energy bills, and how we become much more resilient moving forward. And I think that's something that we're still not entirely there on. I mean, we've got some good case studies now coming out. You've got National Grid and the Great Grid Upgrade to try and raise public awareness on the scale and pace of change that we need to bring forward in the transmission network. But I do still think that a lot of that is falling short, and we're not probably still trying to do enough on a case-by-case basis to adequately address some of those concerns and really understand the areas before we even start to engage. I think, certainly the NSIP process and the DCO process, it doesn't necessarily always get the best consultation. It's very sporadic. It can often lead to real peaks and troughs within communication, and it's not necessarily so conducive to that two-way conversation. So I think there are a lot of different things that developers do need to consider when they are planning their projects from the outset about how they can really firstly understand the areas and try and tailor their communications accordingly, and how they take people on that journey with them. But that needs to be badged in much more of a national conversation, so everyone has that greater awareness.
Eloise, with pieces of work like the Great Grid Upgrade now coming online and more nationally focused projects, do you think that we'll see a difference and see people, because this seems to be the problem, that people are seeing things in their backyard and thinking, well, okay, that's that, there's a bit here, a bit there, but if we can get it right, we've got a proper national plan and people can see the holistic benefits, not only in terms of energy security, but in jobs, boost the economy, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example of where we've got a platform now to do something that's different to what we've done in the past. We're demonstrating a pipeline to the industry that enables them to invest in the future and create that legacy to be proud of. It allows us to embed social value in its broadest context throughout the entirety, right from the initial optioneering stages through to delivery. And that is something that we haven't necessarily been able to do on the scale that we through the contracting mechanisms we've had in the past. The community engagement piece around it is essential, and it's around not having a one-size-fits-all approach. You talked about the political differences, the geographic differences, as well as the age differences, and having some element of knowledge of how to communicate to all the different people within a community that need to enable something as large as the Great Grid Upgrade to happen. It is where the difference will happen, the difference will be made.
Is it worth just quickly explaining what the Great Grid Upgrade is?
Yes. So,
just for anyone listening or in the audience who might not be clear.
Well, essentially, it's the rewiring of England and Wales. So our transmission system has been built in the 1950s, and over the next 7 years, we've got to deliver more infrastructure within the transmission sector than has been delivered in the last 40. So it's an enterprise partnership that's been developed by National Grid, bringing together consultants and designers alongside contractors to be able to make a true difference. So it's that collaboration piece, 1 + 1 = more than 2, and our ability to make a difference. So Paul's really directly on the fourth P, the portfolio piece, and creating a platform that brings all the diversity of thinking into one place to make a significant difference.
Thank you for listening to our Talking Infrastructure Season 3 podcast. If you have a minute, we'd love it if you could leave a review, as this helps us to reach other people and a much wider audience. Thank you for listening. Now back to the episode. Jeremy, talking about government, how important, and you mentioned you were funding from the UK Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah.
How important is it for government to set out a confident long-term strategy to make sure people really see the benefits coming? And I think I know the answer.
Yeah, one of my great passions. Really, I think the government has, if you look at the journey that we've gone down over the last 7 years, Britain went from, we don't care about domestic sources of these materials. We're going to import everything from China. We're an importing nation, to realizing that when the invasion of Ukraine happened, and with everything else that's going on in the world, the tragic events that we've seen recently, that we actually government actually has to intervene. And this is not just the UK government. You've seen the US government with the Inflation Reduction Act. You've seen the EU react with the Critical Minerals Act, and the fact that we have to build something new. And I think the danger was that the press were talking us down. We're talking the UK down. And I said to one of the journalists, look, if you carry on talking us down, we're going to end up even worse. Now, I think that the energy transition and climate change has stimulated a national pride in actually building it back better, rebuilding the UK. What's been lacking, in my view, as a industrial strategy. We have had no industrial strategy at all, and that is beginning to change. And whoever gets in, that will be a key factor. And really, if we don't build things here, we're not just generating no jobs here, we're exporting those jobs to China or wherever else. We're exporting jobs to somewhere else, not developing them here. So there's a tendency to think, we just should give up. We can't do it. We need to just import everything. That's wrong. We've got a automotive industry here which employs 800,000 people indirectly and directly. Are we just going to throw that away and let China build all the cars that we drive on the roads? Mm-hmm. Good question. But really, I think we need to government needs to step in, and is stepping in and saying, no, we need to think about this very, very carefully. One minister actually said to me, we suddenly realized that Britain's on their own, that China, we were facing off against China. We all know about that. Then the Inflation Reduction Act happened, massive stimulation by government in the US. Then the EU starts stepping up, and Britain is sat there on its own, not knowing what to do. Well, we have to step up to that plate and really start talking ourselves up rather than talking ourselves down. And I think that's really, really a positive thing. And of course, that does obviously play into our projects, that there's a growing sense that we need security of these metals that are going to make things change. I mean, we're going from a whole industry and lifestyle based on burning things. Once you burn a fossil fuel, it's gone forever. Whereas an interaction between a metal and another metal, where you build a battery with lithium and graphite, whatever, it's infinitely recyclable. You're talking about atomic scale. You can recycle that battery and keep it going. You're not destroying anything. That is key, because by 2050, we'll look back and think, what on earth are we doing driving around in cars with a chimney sticking out of the back of the car? What are we doing without renewable energy? And it will be a hugely different world we will live in 50 years, what is it? Nearly 30 years.
Yeah. And I think there's a point there that you make, and around some of the myths, and you talk about recycling of batteries, and people on the ground not really, and as a former journalist, I've got to be careful that some of my former colleagues didn't drive us down too much. But there is an issue, isn't there? These myths, especially across social media, etc. The dirty batteries, and what are we going to do with them, and how do we cut through with that?
Well, we tell the story. There's a stark choice. If we don't go down the energy transition and batteries and renewable energy, we just go back to burning fossil fuels. That is the stark reality. And that might be fine. At the moment, we have to put up with the inconvenience. We used to go and fill up in a petrol station. 2 minutes later, we're walking away. We can drive another 400 miles. It's inconvenient at the moment that we have to charge up. I drive an electric car. I find it perfectly fine. It's great, but we have to really face up to the reality of, and the necessity of changing. And it's not the most convenient thing. It's going to be a little bit inconvenient, but it will enable the new reality. And most young people want to see this happen. They know what's happening. It's heating up. The world's heating up. The ice caps are melting. We can either carry on with that, and we'll all end up underwater. And the other thing, as a mining engineer and a geologist, we're not trying to save the planet. The planet will be absolutely fine, mark my words, but we just won't be on it. That's a simple fact.
From that point, Sarah, you're also a local councillor, but Barnet, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Speaking to local communities there, do you feel that people are getting a better understanding of the challenge and the benefits of what we're trying to achieve?
I would say from a hyper-local perspective, we don't necessarily have quite as much of the national infrastructure arriving on our doorstep, actually. I mean, it's a bit of a colloquial story, but it lends into it. I was a trustee of a community trust up in Edgware, and they were personally trying to decarbonise their own operation. That's where a lot of charity grant funding is now linked. You've got to be able to evidence that really, really strongly. And they would just want to put solar panels on their roof to start off with, to start their journey towards decarbonisation. But the resources available to them within other projects happening in the area were so minimal, and it took so long for something that should be really quite simple. And I do remember thinking, UKPN, they're the nearest sort of DNO to us. Would they have any expertise or any community funding that could be accessed? And the stark reality was no. So even from my own personal experience, it can be really very difficult to try and bring about that real community benefit. On the flip side of things, I mean, I don't know where the statistics now currently sit, but there was a moment in time where Barnet had the highest amount of electric vehicles. It was one of the first areas where it really sort of gained a lot of pace. And obviously that's required us to think very proactively about how we get around EV charging. The one point that I probably would make as well from a local government perspective is that all of these projects are enormously resource draining. We are still, the scale of the change again that we are seeing is putting a huge impact on, the planning teams and what have you. And I think what might be easier, and I know this formed part of the government consultation, is if we have a little bit more structure around what community benefits might be appropriate. because there is just such a divide as well about how you can get these community benefits actually realised on the ground. I think it is very difficult in areas where you do have a lot of localised project resistance to have that conversation about community benefits, because it can sometimes, come across as the community feeling like they're being bribed in some way to have this infrastructure that they don't want. So it potentially would be a good idea, and I'm quite interested as to the view of the rest of the panel on this, whether we do have a little bit more structure, more guidance that would help local authorities in terms of what they should be reasonably requesting out of developers. And it would also give the community far more understanding of the benefits and how to access them, because there are a number of really good examples of community funds that are really locally led, but we can't get that on all projects if there is a lot of anxiety at a local level and people are effectively stuck at first principles.
The question obviously always comes up about how we're going to pay for these things. And perhaps some of the reluctance at a family level, a community level is, well, that's great, but who's going to put the money forward? And we've touched on the UK Infrastructure Bank. Eloise, again, some of the benefits around it. How do we find the cash to pay for all this?
Yeah, there's no simple answer, is there? But it has to be around some kind of private with public, backed up by national policy that demonstrates commitment to the spend. There was a speaker yesterday from an investment bank who spoke very clearly and eloquently around creating those portfolios, so creating projects that are investable. So, if somebody or an entity has, the example that was given, 50 million to invest, but the projects that are all coming through are 100 million in value, that the risk profile doesn't sit well for that. But if they're 500 million, then there's a discussion to be had. So how do we create those projects as a nation that enable that private sector money to come into and enable the public to spend?
Yeah, I think the problem, and having gone through exactly this issue, who's going to pay for it, is that this is very long dated money. Infrastructure projects take a long time to build. A lithium mine, for example, takes a long time to build. Solar project, probably quite a long time as well. And a lot of investors have a very, very short time period for being judged on their performance. So what we've got to do is to try, and government, I think, has to lead again on this. Don't want to put everything on government, but it's to encourage UK pension funds that actually this is a good long-term investment. A solar farm is a really good long-term investment. It's an annuity. We'll keep on giving. And it's really that, as Eloise just said, a public-private sector partnership is the best way forward to crowd in investors. There's no shortage of investors out there. It's just to try and attract them long-term. And there's a lot of investors out of the Middle East who would very happily invest in the UK. They need to be shown the way forward, and how do we engage with them and bring them in? Yeah.
We've touched on it a little bit, but some of the benefits around this are in acting as that catalyst for education, for skills, developing that workforce of the future. Are we switched on to that yet? And that was no pun intended, being switched on. But are we? Or are the lights still off? No.
I don't think the lights are off. I think maybe they're slightly dimmer than they should be. As a personal example, my son's doing a GCSE in construction and the built environment, which is just fantastic. And he's top of his class, by the way. Which I'm very proud of. But that just shows, and that's a new GCSE for his school in particular. So it shows that we are facing the challenge slightly differently. We just have to look at the apprenticeship approach. Had a discussion this morning on returners. So these are all things, but they require so much energy and a different way of thinking that if we aren't committed and it doesn't have the sponsorship throughout government, local government and companies, it won't move forward. So yes, we are doing things differently. Is there still a long way to go? Could we be moving faster? Yes, as well.
Want more insights from infrastructure industry experts? Check out our latest Future of Infrastructure Global Research Report. In it, we explore one of the most complex, important shifts happening across the world today, the energy transition, and what it means for you. We surveyed nearly 850 senior executives and interviewed public and private sector leaders to find practical, profitable, predictable, and people-centric pathways to net zero. To explore the research, please visit infrastructure.aecom.com. Thank you for listening. Now back to the episode.
Sarah, from your report, are there particular recommendations that have come out of this to increase people's awareness, increase people's buy-in?
I wouldn't go as far to say there's necessarily a real clear set sort of this is what we must do in order to overcome these challenges. I think the industry as a whole bears a lot of responsibility for this as a collective. As you said, a lot of these issues probably do sit with government, but that's not it in its entirety. Yes, I think we've probably already identified that government can provide some clearer guidance on how to bring communities sort of with us, and we can get more consensus at a local level about what good looks like and how we position and respond to a lot of those common concerns that we hear about different parts of the industry. But then we also have responsibilities as, industry professionals, and especially on the development side, to be trying to have a really full and honest and two-way dialogue. You do not get community benefit without good consultation. Those two things are intrinsically linked. Without one, the other will be a flop. So then that sits within all of us. So I would think those are the two greatest sort of elements for it, because we can't be, we've identified there is probably a bit of a deficiency in the national conversation, but we're such a huge part of that. And I think especially when you come to something like UKREiiF, you never sort of get the same scenario where there are so many people who believe so passionately about the benefits of the built environment and what this can achieve and what, true benefits this can bring about into people's day-to-day lives. We need to be really showing up, especially if we potentially have a change of government, and making our voice very clearly heard, because there are huge transformational benefits that all of this can bring about.
I'm going to come for questions in a minute, but Eloise, maybe just to sort of wrap things up a little bit, are we going to get there?
Yeah, of course we are. We've got no choice but to get there. Together, if we pull together and bring our collective to the problem, then we will absolutely get there.
Jeremy, are you confident?
I'm very confident. And if you ask most young people, when I was growing up, my biggest fear and kept me awake at night is nuclear war. Maybe that's coming back, unfortunately, but it's now climate change. So it is motivating young people to how do they affect and how do they bring about change? And, what I would say is, more young people need to do STEM subjects, but we're going to get there. We will get there. We have to. Otherwise, the planet will just simply move on without us.
Are there any questions from the floor? Jennifer, straight in there. And for our listeners, I promised that the first question would be rewarded with a Talking Infrastructure mug. So there we are.
Thanks, James, and thanks, panel, for such a really comprehensive description of where we stand in this. I'm Jennifer Dixon. I work with Faraday Pollard. We're a specialist architectural firm working at the interface of infrastructure and the architectural profession. It's the only sector we work in, so it's quite a focus. And so we deal with community engagement around major infrastructure projects all the time as part of our day-to-day. And we've talked a lot about what sweeteners might be given to the local community. But I'm actually really interested in what is it that they're scared of, because people like us, of course, working at that to help dismiss some of those fears, and also to find ways that infrastructure projects can be more acceptable. And I sort of put it into three categories. Is it about disruption during the process? Because sometimes these projects are long and they can blight sort of several years of somebody's life. Is it a spoiled environment for them living long term? Or is it the actual physical environment? Or is it a long-term degradation of their environment they live in, like more traffic and that sort of thing? And I'd just be interested to know from the panel where they think the fears really are and what people like us can do to start to address those.
That's a great question, Jennifer. I think you've captured it quite nicely in your three parts there. But if you roll it at one level, it's probably scared of the unknown, and that's a really hard place to be in. If you take it to a national grid example, which is where a lot of my background is, we have 99.998% reliability within our electricity network. About half the world can't say that. So, the fact that we use our plug, get our phone charged, etc., we just assume that as part of our environment. If we don't make some of the major infrastructure upgrading that needs to happen, that basis of assumption will be wrong. But that's really hard to explain when we've always had it on tap. The same with other aspects of our infrastructure. So I would just say it's the unknown, and explaining with clear language and consistent language as to why big projects and big programs need to happen.
I think it's from our communities, it's all three. It's, do they get disrupted during the project being built? Does it spoil the environment? I would be concerned if somebody said they were going to build a new whatever in next to my house. You'd be worried about these things. And it's really to explain step by step in a genuinely consultative way how it will actually improve their life rather than make it more difficult. It's very interesting to hear from your survey that the biggest thing is transport, and the other one was, I wrote it down.
So support for new energy. That was the most sort of desired outcome for those living south of the Humber, north of the Humber. In effect, I don't know why I picked the Humber as the as the area, but and then north is rail and public transport. But in terms of the concerns, the top two, ecology and impact on existing infrastructure. The third one, which we were expecting again to be a little bit higher, was cumulative impact. And I think that's possibly something we haven't necessarily touched on quite as much, that we expect that level of concern to very much rise, especially if there are more than one construction project going on in a particular area over a prolonged period of time. I think that is still seen as not being as joined up as it possibly could be. And again, that's probably something for the industry as much to consider about in areas where you are engaging, where there are multiple projects. One, how do you actually engage effectively to the point where you don't absolutely fatigue the community? And how do you actually show that you can work together in order to address the concerns? It's quite often something you can't necessarily do just on a project by project basis.
So perhaps we need a question in next year's saying, what are you afraid of?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the fear of the unknown, isn't it? And I think as human beings, we always have the tendency to think the worst about something we don't necessarily know. And we've been having this discussion a lot, again, in the context of transmission and the sort of the difference between overhead line versus underground cables, and ultimately what that will look like at the point in which it's complete, which is, if the project is done well, effectively a completely unspoiled and reinstated landscape. But that's very difficult to explain to people when there also haven't been a load of other projects in which they can see and understand and get that sort of comfort that we aren't just saying this to people because it's what they want to hear. This is exactly how it will be constructed. And I think that's also part of the timing in which we are in for a lot of our national infrastructure upgrades. We're still sort of very much at the start of the process rather than the end. So that does create some sort of, it's the hurdle to get over in that education barrier, isn't it?
Great.
I think it can be summarised a little bit towards trust, can't it?
Absolutely.
And I think there has been a lack of, or a diminishing trust in our ability as a nation to deliver this large infrastructure. And it will take time to rebuild that.
Another question. Gentlemen, please introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Bilal from BRE, Building Research Establishment. So pleasure to be here and great to hear all your answers. So we are currently working in a similar industry or similar area, trying to educate the industry. And I very much agree a single thread from national government to form local is needed. So my question really was, what would you say is the biggest challenge to impact or maybe embed infrastructure in the future? I don't know if you could sum up maybe what your takeaways are.
Biggest challenge in the future? Well, if we've had a snap election called, perhaps while we've been talking, that might be one of the challenges. But what are the challenges? What do we face?
I think one of the biggest challenges is that with social media now amplifying the disinformation, the lack of trust. If you make something, if the community gets hold of something which is possibly incorrect or worried about, that is a massive challenge, that it spreads so quickly, and putting those fires out is very, very difficult. I think I'd say that social media is one of the most difficult things to manage, both from the information and disinformation side. Very important. Interesting.
I think I might, continue with that theme of trust. I mean, I'm trying, I can't recall the statistics off the top of my head, but there have been, multiple studies in which, people's trust in institutions, the media, politicians have all continued to decrease. And that really does impact on your ability to be able to have that sort of conversation. And I think, to play on the political point a little bit more, we are in we're seeing it now, we're in a really heightened political time. We've got a lot of new candidates from all sides of the political spectrum, all of which are looking for their sort of thread for their campaign. And 9 times out of 10, you go with what people are concerned about, which again, that then spills over into whatever the governmental position happens to be on the other end of it. I mentioned the ministerial statement about solar earlier. I mean, that's a really good example of those solar projects, especially in a lot of sort of conservative heartlands, becoming very unpopular, and the government really feeling that they've got to sort of have in some way a statement to resolve that, to help the local campaigns on the ground. So I think that sort of political volatility does impact the ability to have that sustained conversation in a way that does build trust and people really understand the drivers for it.
Yeah, I was going to say people. It's probably the biggest challenge, whether that's the people that create the national agenda, or the people that the community get affected by, or the people that implement the agenda. It's just all about people.
I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman at the front, please.
Hi, Rob Smith from Croftstone. It's really going on what you said before about with the number of MPs earmarked to lose their seats or leave, does that hinder or give you an opportunity to set the agenda? And bearing in mind the number of housing ministers we've had in the last 14 years, is that an impossible task? Who wants to tackle that?
I'm happy to start it off. I think there are opportunities and challenges with both. So, for instance, we talk about obviously housing being a big part of the national infrastructure conversation. When you look at the amount of Labour's candidates, a significant amount have come from local government, which actually we think is probably going to be quite a positive step in and around, the infrastructure debate and certainly the housing debate. On the other side of it, then there is always a period in which politics needs to settle, agendas need to be, taken from manifesto commitments into a firm policy programme. And I think when you do have a lot of new MPs and new intake, there can be sometimes a little bit more of sort of an uncertain approach, perhaps, and very much concerned about how things are going to be perceived within the constituency. So there's a number of different ways that it can be taken, but actually I think, the one thing that we have seen quite consistently, I think, in the pieces of the general election campaign thus far, is the importance of getting infrastructure in this country right. So I think we can all be reasonably reassured that the overall signals are all leading into quite a positive place. And in many instances, we're going to have a lot of very well-informed, very experienced candidates taking this forward.
I think by the nature of the professionals inside this room and wider here at Leeds, you look for the opportunity in the face of a challenge anyway. But it feels to me that we've been somewhat stagnant for too long, and that just to be able to take action forward will be a relief for me personally. Anyway,
I think that's absolutely right. We've had 14 years of almost complacency, same government. Nothing changed. And then suddenly, whoever wins this election, there's a sense of urgency to make that change. There's a sense that we do need to do something about climate change. We need to do something about renewable energy. So that whatever happens, there's a renewed sense of urgency, which is great.
Excellent. Well, I think time is against us. So it just remains for me to thank my panelists today. Thank you, Jeremy, Eloise and Sarah. And of course, thank you to the audience for being so engaged and asking some fantastic questions.